Hi folks, I'm Peter Lemieux with Rounding Third. I tell baseball stories. So let me tell you how this one starts. I was driving down the road listening to my classic rock, 60s, 70s, 80s. Beyond that might be a little too modern for me. A song came on by Simon and Garfunkel called Mrs. Robinson. Perhaps some of you remember it. It doesn't matter. There's a line in this song that says, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Our nation turns its lonely eyes to you." And I thought to myself, hey, Joe DiMaggio, let's talk about him. What I found out is I can't talk about Joe DiMaggio in the short time I like to take. It's way overwhelming. So let me focus on just a little bit of his story, and no, it's not Marilyn Monroe. After the hit of that song, Paul Simon was having dinner in New York, and wouldn't you know, he looked across the restaurant and there was Joe DiMaggio eating by himself, which he usually did. He had a reputation for being kind of a surly, not pleasant guy. So Paul said he had to get his courage up to go over and introduce himself. And he said, "Mr. DiMaggio, I'm Paul Simon. I'm the guy who wrote the song that asked, 'Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?'" DiMaggio stared at him, looked him up and down, kind of figuring out if he wanted to talk to him. And he said, "Why did you say that? I didn't go anywhere. I'm sitting here in a restaurant." "Oh," he said, "that's not what I meant. I meant that America needs a hero, and that's what you represent." And once he heard that, he had Paul Simon sit down, and they got along okay, right? That's the story of Paul Simon and Joe DiMaggio. I'm going to tell another story about Joe DiMaggio, which is hardly known by people. It's about Joe DiMaggio before he was Joe DiMaggio. But lest I forget, let's just tell you a few highlights. Joe DiMaggio played 13 years in the major leagues, most valuable player 3 times. In his 13 years, the Yankees went to the World Series 10 times and won 9. He's best known for that. He's the guy that set a record for the longest hitting streak in baseball history. He hit safely in 56 consecutive games, a record that most people say never ever going to be broken. But Joe DiMaggio has a history which starts before he was the famous Joe DiMaggio. That's what I'm going to talk about. Joe DiMaggio grew up in San Francisco. He was one of 9 children of Giuseppe and Rosalie DiMaggio. Giuseppe provided for his family as a fisherman in San Francisco rather unsuccessfully. They were very, very poor family, and they had 9 children. At a very young age, it was pretty clear that Joe was not a talker. Even with his friends and stuff, Joe rarely spoke. He was not a good student. He never read books. He never did his homework. When he was a freshman in high school, a teacher made fun of him for not being very smart. And he said to his friends, "I'm out of here." And Joe never returned to school. He would get up in the morning, pretend like he was going to school, and hit the streets. He was after making money. He didn't want to fish with his father, okay? So he hawked papers on the streets. He just did what I would call not illegal, but did street hustles, right? He learned how to win at card games and things like that. Joe was always looking for money. In the meantime, the favorite game of the children was baseball. And one thing came clear to all the people that played with Joe: he could hit the ball farther and harder than any of the other kids. So he was relatively young when a team formed and somebody asked him to play on the team and told him they'd pay him a couple bucks a game. Well, nothing was better to Joe than the money. Well, he went out there and he was very young, playing against older boys. It didn't matter. It didn't matter who was pitching. Joe believed and proved to them that he could hit anybody. And he went on in that, and what happened is people who had baseball teams would come to him and offer him more money to play for the weekend for him. He was kind of like a bat for hire as a youngster. Well, his older brother signed a contract with the San Francisco Seals. Now, San Francisco Seals were in the Pacific Coast League. An explanation is necessary. This is not the minor leagues like we think of it today. The Pacific Coast League was professional baseball in San Francisco. The major leagues did not go west of St. Louis. So there was no major league team. The San Francisco Seals were the biggest team. And his brother talked the Seals into bringing Joe onto the team. I think he was just 18 years old playing against men. Well, Joe took it because he could make money playing baseball. And he could make more money with the Seals than he could in these pickup games. And he could hit. He was an amazing hitter. And the San Francisco sports pages would often be just about Joe. He had, are you ready for this? A 61-game hitting streak for the San Francisco Seals as a young man. Now, the talk was that the Yankees would buy him. The way they got players, they'd go to minor league teams and pay them for the contract of the player. And at this point, Joe was so good that the rumor was they would offer $50,000 to the Seals. But that blew up because Joe injured his knees. One knee, he tore a ligament stepping off of a bus. And he could hardly walk. He played, but he couldn't run. Now, here's the way it worked in baseball at that time. You only got paid if you played. If you didn't play and they replaced you, it was a good possibility your career was over. There was no medical care. If you wanted to get the knee fixed, you had to go to a doctor that you had to pay for, and Joe did not have the money. So there was a chance, because he could hardly walk, that at the age of 18, young Joe was going to have to go back to fishing with his dad. Because he's a great athlete, after about 3 months, the knee healed. And in 1935, he returned to the San Francisco Seals. Now, the Yankees pulled their offer because they didn't know if he was ever going to play again. In 1935, Joe DiMaggio batted .398 in the Pacific Coast League, and it was clear he was a tremendous hitter. But 1935, we're in the middle of a depression, and the jobs were few, money was few. Let's go to New York. The New York Yankees, who did not like losing, had gone through the retirement of Babe Ruth. And in 1934 and 1935, they did not win the pennant, but finished second. Even though they had Lou Gehrig and Bill Dickey, they couldn't win the pennant. And the owner said not finishing first was unacceptable. So they came after young Joe. Only the offer now was $25,000, not $50,000. Well, that's the first part of it. Then they have to offer a contract to Joe. So here's the story. The Yankees offered him an annual pay of $5,625. Well, Joe looked at that and said, I'm making almost that at the Seals, and I'm staying in my hometown of San Francisco. So he didn't want to accept it. Interesting part of the story, for some reason, Ty Cobb had become friends with Joe DiMaggio, and he was coaching him through the negotiations. And he said, don't sign that. Write him a letter. In fact, he had people help write the letter because Joe wasn't really that educated in doing that. And the Yankees came back with a new offer, $6,500. Cobb looked at that and he said, that's not enough. Write another letter to them. This is the response they got when they turned down the $6,500. We're offering you $8,500. This is a quote. This is the limit. Don't waste another 3-cent stamp. Just sign it and tell Cobb to stop writing us letters. Well, Joe took the 8,500, and he had to report to spring training in Florida. Well, air flights being what they were, the decision was he would drive from San Francisco to Florida. And it just so happened there were two Italians on the Yankees from San Francisco, Tony Lazzeri and Cookie Lavagetto. And they offered to drive with Joe to spring training. What, 3,500 miles? No superhighways, just driving through America, the three of them. One guy drove for 4 hours, the second guy for 4 hours, and then they said to Joe, "Your turn." And Joe said, "I don't drive." So they had to go the whole way with only two people driving. When they got to Florida for spring training, Joe was not intimidated by the pitching. He just knew he could hit this. The Yankees were so excited about having this guy that the press was down there ready to make him a hero. They didn't even cover Lou Gehrig. They were talking about young 20-year-old Joe DiMaggio. So much so, here's the headlines from a spring training game. Rookie outfielder blasts 3 homers in his debut. However, if you read the article, you found out he hit them in batting practice. But they wanted the people of New York to think that they had just gotten the next Babe Ruth, right? And Joe could hit, but he got hurt. And he didn't get to play in the first 18 games of the Yankees season. When he came in, it was the 19th game. And for about 6 or 7 days, every article about the ball game started with Joe. No matter what happened, they would say, Joe got 2 hits. One game, Bill Dickey hit 2 homers, and the headlines were, Joe gets 2 hits. They were just talking about Joe, and the fans, especially the Italian population, were just coming in to see the guy who would become the Yankee Clipper. So that's kind of a history of how Joe got into the major leagues. I will close with this conclusion about his first year. Even though he didn't play in the first 18 games, Joe DiMaggio set a franchise record for rookies in 1936. He hit 29 home runs in only 138 games. By the way, that record stood for 80 years until Aaron Judge beat it in 2017. They went on to win the World Series, and like I said, they won 9 World Series with Joe DiMaggio in there. But he is a baseball icon for sure. You want to know why the Yankees were great? How would you like to have Hall of Famer Joe DiMaggio on your team for 13 years, and when he retires, you bring in Mickey Mantle? Kind of tells the story. Well, that's for today. I'm looking forward to your guys' stories about Joltin' Joe or other great people from the past. I had a great time. Look forward to seeing you guys again in my next story.